All right, welcome. It's amazing to see such a large crowd here for this talk today. So we really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. I'm Jasleen Coley. I direct the Critical Race Studies program here at the law school. We are co-sponsoring this with the Williams Institute as well. And also we're lucky enough to have the criminal justice program, the prison law and policy program, and our public interest law and policy program, also the Epstein program, also co-sponsor this event. So thank you to all of our co-sponsors as well. So I want to introduce the lovely Priscilla Ocen, who is a professor of law at Loyola Law School, where she teaches criminal law, family law, and a seminar on race, gender, and the law. Her work basically examines the relationship between race, gender, and systems of punishment. Her work also explores the ways in which race, gender, and class interact to render women of color vulnerable to various forms of violence and criminalization. In particular, her work draws attention to the ways in which criminalization and incarceration are used to police the reproductive choices of poor women of color. Her work has appeared in academic journals such as the California Law Review, the UCLA Law Review, the George Washington Law Review, UC Davis, and Du Bois, as well as popular media outlets such as the Los Angeles Daily Journal, Ebony Magazine, and Al Jazeera. She is also the co-author of the influential policy report, Black Girls Matter, Pushed Out, Overpoliced, and Underprotected. And the report was a part of a larger effort co-organized by Priscilla and by others to highlight the various forms of discipline and punishment experienced by Black girls, which are often overlooked in mainstream advocacy efforts and policy initiatives. She has also applied her work to broader advocacy efforts. She served as a trainer for the federal public defenders, assisted with the development of new programs in domestic violence centers in South LA, strategized with community groups regarding efforts to monitor conditions of confinement in LA County Women's Jail. And she was recently appointed to serve as a member of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Oversight Commission, where she is now vice chair and is a proponent of the Reform LA Jails Initiative. Prior to joining Loyola Law School, she was actually a critical race studies fellow here at UCLA, where she also graduated from in 2007.
It said 2006 on the flyer.
I know. I've heard this already. And we apologize. While she was here at UCLA, she was described by some of her faculty as a force of nature. And I heard one story, I'm trying to remember who told me this, but I think it was Professor Crenshaw or Professor Harris, where during a symposium, while Priscilla was a student, another faculty member from another school asked, "Oh, I didn't know that you had hired this new young law professor." And they were thinking like, wait, what are you talking about? And then realized they were talking about Priscilla, who was a student at the time. So while she was here as a fellow, she taught a course on critical race theory and a seminar on race, gender, and incarceration. She also was a law clerk on the Sixth Circuit, and she was the Thurgood Marshall Fellow at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in San Francisco, where she worked on various racial justice issues, including voting rights, police misconduct, and conditions of confinement in women's prisons. She also spearheaded the creation of a Black Women's Reentry Project. She also serves as a member of the board of directors for Equal Justice Society, which is an organization dedicated to transforming the nation's consciousness on race through law, social sciences, and the arts. Speaking of the arts, she also just had a film debut at the LA Film Festival. So she is now acting as well.
That was supposed to be secret.
Yeah, oops. And she also kills it at karaoke. So she is multi-talented.
Thank you.
Yes. All right, so thank you so much. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I actually don't have anything else to say. That was it. Thank you, Jasleen, for that comprehensive introduction, that generous introduction. It is true that I'm very good at karaoke, although once we get to know each other better, we can do some karaoke stuff. Not today. I also want to thank the Critical Race Studies Program, the Williams Institute, and all the other co-sponsors for inviting me to give this talk about some of my work on race and gender dynamics in the operation of the criminal justice system and the carceral state. I think this conversation is particularly important given the ways in which the current administration is literally ripping children out of the arms of their parents in detention centers and saying that this is an unintended or an inevitable consequence of the criminalization or the criminal activities of their parents who entered the country illegally. This is not inevitable, right? This is not unintentional, I should say. This is a product of the way in which prisons have come to operate in this country to facilitate what Orlando Patterson calls natal alienation, right? Familial alienation. And I'm going to talk about how that particularly applies in the context of women's prisons. I'm particularly excited to join you today because this is the place where I really cut my teeth intellectually and in terms of my advocacy experience. As a student, that's me in the upper right-hand corner. I don't know if you can see me. I'm like in the pink t-shirt back when I was young and energetic. I participated in a variety of different programs, which I hope many of you will take advantage of as they exist here. This was in the upper right-hand corner, that's a photo from a group of students who went to do legal work in New Orleans after Katrina. And this is part of a program that we started here, which I believe still exists, the Prisoner Reentry Initiative, which created the Reentry Clinic in partnership with Susan Burton and A New Way of Life. Part of what we were doing was trying to get legal protections for formerly incarcerated people in the context of employment. An outgrowth of that was the expungement clinic that still today exists 10 years later. And the clinic will be getting a commendation from the LA County Board of Supervisors at its next meeting. So I think UCLA should be quite proud of it, as I am. The Reentry Initiative was quite formative for me. When I started working on the Reentry Initiative, I had some experience dealing with the criminal justice system as a policy advocate, working for members of the state legislature. And mostly I worked on juvenile justice. I worked on trying to dismantle what was then known as the California Youth Authority, which otherwise was basically a violent, horrific space where children were sent to be abused in prison-like conditions. The CYA, thankfully, no longer exists. But this particular program, this particular initiative, in partnership with the Critical Race Studies Program, helped me to understand the specific issues that women and girls experience in the criminal justice system that weren't being addressed in the larger advocacy regarding anti-prison efforts or mass incarceration. And so I really wanted to, when I began to practice and when I went into my fellowship here as a Critical Race Studies Fellow, that's what I wanted to do, was sort of excavate the ways in which women and girls of color, particularly Black girls, were subject to policing and incarceration, to reveal the important gender dynamics at the core of our carceral state. So this is where I come from, right? And when I say the carceral state, as I'm using it here, both in the title and as I'll use it in my talk, I refer to the ways in which the state exerts control over populations through punishment as a means to produce what Foucault calls docile and capable bodies. The paradigmatic example of this, of course, is imprisonment and punishment, and incarceration as a means of punishment. But the carceral state extends well beyond that, right? It exists in the context of policing on the front end, social welfare institutions, educational institutions, and dependency institutions like foster care. In each of these institutions, women of color are subject to invasive government regulation of the most intimate aspects of their lives, including their reproductive and familial choices. Through these institutions, the state exerts power over the disenfranchised and the vulnerable, ensuring conformity with the white heteropatriarchal norm by punishing unruly, non-compliant, and undisciplined bodies. Over the last 40 years, the carceral state has particularly come to impact women of color, and women generally, but in particular Black and Latinx women, gender nonconforming people, and queer women. For example, a recent report by the Human Rights Watch notes just 40 years ago, about 3/4 of county jails in the United States did not house any women. Today, nearly all jails house women. Over the last 40 years, as you can see from this chart, the rate of women who are being incarcerated has increased dramatically by over 800%. This means that women are the fastest growing prison population in the country. On an annual basis, over 1.5 million women churn in and out of our jails, and another million women are on probation or parole. Right, so the state has exerted significant control over women, particularly poor Black and brown women. Right, the expanded use of policing and imprisonment against women has had a devastating impact, not only on the women themselves, but on their children, their families, and communities. Because of the dramatic increase in women's incarceration, scenes like the one I'm about to show you play out in prison facilities across the country. Okay, this is where I can't figure out how to use this. Wait, I don't know what just happened. All right, well, maybe I won't be showing you guys the video, so we may have to skip over this. Yeah, we'll come back to it. Let me see if I can get this thing going back again. All right, one second. Is there like a tech person in here that can, Jasleen, okay. All right. Just talk amongst yourselves. All right. Is this on? The mouse is not working. Oh, okay, there's the mouse. Okay, there it is. There it is. There it is. Okay. There it is. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Here we go. All right, we got it.
Hi, Judah. Things haven't been great for us so far. Being away from you for 3 years is killing me. It seems like an eternity. And Granny can't come here because of her heart issues, but this is the perfect opportunity for us to see each other after such a long time. I'm so excited and feel like I'm a little kid. See you soon. Love, Mom.
Okay. When you go in, these people are going to be very caring to you, and they're going to ask to see your paperwork. Just make sure you have it with you. And you're going to go through a metal detector. It's not scary. You're going to be fine.
You're almost there, so close. Like, you're going to get in, right? I'm not going to look against my way. We're going to be in. We got somebody in our talking right now. I got you covered. Okay?
I couldn't bring her candle in or her wife. I had to take her wax off.
Oh, she's sleeping.
You gotta come over here. I would like, may I have, how about, y'all look so good. A drink. So what did you get? It's not these. No, it didn't hurt.
Are you not covering the lines, guys?
You know, to be able to go and be advised something since your graduation.
It was fun, but it wasn't fun. When I left, I tried not to think about it as much, because I knew that would just make me even more emotional than I already am. And there was nothing I could do about it, so it's like, you have to accept the fact that you have to leave. I'm kind of used to this stuff because she's been in jail before, and also my dad left me when I was 3, and he died when I was 9. So it's like, I'm sort of kind of getting used to the feel of like getting hurt.
video because I want us to be very grounded in what this means, right, for women and their children. What incapacitating motherhood really looks like, right? Most women who are incarcerated are mothers. 60% of women in state and federal facilities are mothers, primary caretakers of small children. 80% of women in jails are mothers, primary caretakers of small children. And I visit women at the California Institute for Women in Corona, California. I visited women at Valley State Prison and this California Central Facility for Women. And the number one question is, what's happening with my children? Nearly all of them want to know and need some legal support regarding their children. They're afraid they're going to lose them. For women, and I'll talk more about this toward the end of my talk, nearly 70% have other family members taking care of their child. Roughly 10%, which is 3 times more than men, have children in the foster care system. To give you a sense of comparison, men typically have about roughly 30% of men have their children living with someone other than their mother, right? So for men, right, the risk, obviously there's similar sort of emotional effects of being separated from their children, but they don't face the same sort of risks regarding the loss of their parental rights to the state or to other family members or to someone else in the foster care system. This is an omnipresent risk for women who are incarcerated and people who are incarcerated in women's facilities. So given the expanded use, and I'm going to go back to this chart here, right? This gives us the scope, and it tells you the kinds of crimes that women are incarcerated for. Mostly it's nonviolent property and drug crimes, which is distinct from men who are roughly 47% of men are incarcerated, or 50% of men are incarcerated for violent crimes, which is not to suggest that they deserve to be in prison for extended periods of time, but it just goes to show you how the state is regulating women. And I'll get more into the kind of granular details, particularly for women who are in jails, which is where most women are incarcerated. So given the expanded use of the carceral state to regulate and control the bodies of women, scholars from a range of disciplines, including history, sociology, feminist and queer theory, have highlighted and theorized how race and gender are constructed and policed by the criminal legal system and other punitive institutions like social welfare. So here I'm giving shouts out to folks like Professor Crenshaw, Andrea Ritchie, Beth Ritchie, Sarah Haley, who's here at UCLA, Dorothy Roberts, Sarah Deer, Miriam Kaba, and many others. My most recent project, which I entitled Incapacitating Motherhood, which you can download on SSRN, because I know most of you law students don't have enough to do. So if you'd like some extra reading, you can check it out. And I'm going to talk about some of the arguments I make in Incapacitating Motherhood. I argue that a central function of women's prisons is the incapacitation of the reproductive and familial autonomy of women who are perceived to be unfit, undisciplined, and unruly. Right, so let me move on here. Right, so what is incapacitation? Right, incapacitation is often understood as a theory or justification for punishment. Right, shout out to first year criminal law, right? So you have various kinds of theories that justify why we punish people, why we cause people to suffer, why we stigmatize them, why we remove them from their communities, right? We ought to have a good reason for doing so, right? So we have various theories of punishment, retribution, specific and general deterrence, and one of them is incapacitation, right? And this posits that basically what we want to do is remove dangerous people from our society, right? And they can be dangerous along a number of different measures, right? One could be a physical threat, but for women, right, they're perceived of as an existential threat because of the sort of biological hazard that their reproduction poses to the society. Right, incapacitation has been utilized as an argument by conservative theorists and criminologists, such as James Q. Wilson, whose one of the significant contribution was the theory of broken windows policing, right, which was about predictive and proactive policing to try to stop the threat before it materializes. And that is precisely what's happening with women who are incarcerated, right? They're seen as a threat. And in many cases, the kinds of things that they are arrested for, prosecuted for, incarcerated for, are seen as sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of the danger that they present. And that's what I'm going to talk about here in just a bit. Right, so what does this mean, right? So we've talked about incapacitation largely in very masculine terms, right? In terms of when we talk about incapacitation theory and how it applies to prisons and how it applies as a justification for incarceration. But women have largely been left out of the picture. And this is what I'm trying to contest and what I'm trying to do in this project to expand how we understand the function of incapacitation. Right, we think about incapacitation as it applies to Black men who are perceived of as dangerous, violent risks to the society, right? It's about the risk that they pose that justifies why they are incarcerated in places like prisons and jails. And there's a different kind of risk that, say, Black and Latinx women pose to the society in terms of how they are constructed as deviant mothers, right? Hypersexual beings who are their uncontrollable lust poses a threat to the coffers of society because of the cost that their childbearing will pose on various governmental institutions. And there are stereotypes around their failed ability to mother, right? This idea that Moynihan posited as sort of a tangle of pathology, that they produce children who are pathological, rule breakers, criminals, and that then also exacts a cost on the society. So I want to talk about how those stereotypes about Black women and Latinas who are theorized, again, as taking advantage of the society and the resources that the society provides, sort of the construct of the anchor baby is probably the best articulation of that. So I want to talk about how incapacitation functions in the context of the criminal justice system in both race and gender ways to regulate women in the criminal justice system, right? So why is this important, right? So we can think about how these various institutions function. I'm gonna skip over this to get to why, okay, so this is totally out of control. Okay, this is not in order. I'm actually gonna go back a bit so that we can get on the same page. Okay, here we go. So why does this matter? Right, so we have a variety of different, I've listed here a variety of different reasons why it's important for us to think about the gender dynamics in the criminal justice system, right? It helps us to understand how gender facilitates mass incarceration and criminalization, right? Even for men, right? Men are understood as hyper-violent, hypersexual. That is a gendered construct that is motivating how it is that we're policing Black and brown communities, Black and brown men. But there's also another story with regard to Black and brown women, right? It helps us to identify patterns in the use of incarceration and incapacitation to regulate women's reproductive capacities. And it highlights the limited ability of law enforcement or law to protect incarcerated women from reproductive abuses. And this frame of using incapacitation suggests that that there is significant utility to alternative strategies. And one of them, as I'll talk about at the end of this talk, is simply the abolition of prisons. And the abolition of women's prisons and the resisting of the construction of women's jails and prisons. Okay, so where does this sort of come from? Right, part of the argument that I'm making is that the regulation of women's reproductive and familial autonomy is rooted in the very base of women's prisons. So women's prisons are much younger than men's prisons, right? The first women's prison was established in 1873 in the state of Indiana, right? The women, but prior to that, women were largely not regulated by the criminal justice system. It wasn't until after the Civil War that Black and white women were increasingly coming under the scope of the criminal justice system. Prior to that, under a system of coverture where women were considered to be the property of either their husbands for white women or those who owned them or asserted ownership over them for black women, right, they were subject to private forms of punishment. But after the Civil War, black and to a lesser extent, white women came under the auspices of the criminal justice system. For most of that time, before women's prisons and reformatories were established, women were placed in men's prisons, in women's wings, right, which is largely a misnomer because they were often placed in one room subject to just horrible, demeaning conditions of confinement, sexual assault, and other forms of abuses, right? This is what spurred the creation of women's prisons to deal with the kinds of abuses that were being reported in men's prisons. Now, this was seen as a progressive reform at the time. And this is one of the things that we should be careful about when we talk about the criminal justice system when people talk about reform. Right? Often reform simply retrenches some of the most problematic aspects of the system while legitimizing it under the guise of improvement. Right? So women's prisons were seen as a reform on existing penal institutions that centered on punishing men. Right, so in that context, right, white women were sent to reform institutions if they were seen as redeemable, because they were seen as women who could be elevated in their standing, to be directed away from their criminal rule breaking into the sort of idealized Victorian woman, this notion of sort of Victorian womanhood, which is about women who were pure, right, who were domestic, who were good mothers, right? So in these reform institutions and in some of these prisons, women were taught to sew, to cook, to clean. Some of them could bring their children to live with them so that they could practice being good mothers on the outside. But for most white women, if they were convicted of a public morals or public order crime, like prostitution, vagrancy, cursing, drinking, again, these are all crimes that are seen as antithetical to femininity or womanhood, right? So the use of the criminal justice system was policing them and their gender presentation. If they were arrested and prosecuted, most of the time they were diverted out, right? Because women were seen as ineligible for punishment because of their soft and delicate nature. That's white women, right? Black women were put into custodial, punitive institutions. And then some of the work that I'll talk about in just a moment by Sarah Haley and Nicole Rafter sort of highlights this disjuncture and this disparity. Other women who were seen as sexually promiscuous or as having had children out of wedlock, as what were called feeble-minded, right? Notions of mental illness or mental instability were deeply rooted in women's performance of femininity and sexuality. Many of them were placed in mental institutions and sterilized. How many of you have read Buck versus Bell? Right, so a handful of you read Buck versus Bell. Basically, in that case, the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes, sanctions the use of sterilization against people who have been adjudicated, particularly women, particularly white women who were adjudicated as feeble-minded because of their sexual promiscuity, let's say. In the case of Carrie Buck, she was actually raped by a family member and became pregnant as a result. But in that case, Justice Holmes said, look, oh, no worries, no worries. We're having a lot of technical difficulties today, so I totally understand.
If you did that in one of my classes, I would be so good.
I don't know if Mercury is in retrograde, but I tend to think anything bad happens. I'm like, that Mercury, it's always in retrograde. All right. So, right, you have the court, Oliver Holmes, right, endorsing the sterilization of Carrie Buck, saying, right, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, right? So you have these various systems, men's institutions where black women were sent often to work on chain gangs and engage in hard labor without their children, right? They were not given the benefit of their womanhood. In Sarah Haley's book, which I'll discuss in a moment, talks about this. But you also, as Nicole Hahn Rafter notes, right, that these institutions were there to restore fallen women to true womanhood. Those who spearheaded these campaigns, and there were often white feminists who were spearheading these the creation of these reform institutions for the establishment of women's reformatories, like most of those who later superintended such institutions, simply did not consider black women to be worthy of their rehabilitative efforts, right? So they weren't seen as worthy of rehabilitation, right? Because the criminality by women was seen as, again, fundamentally incompatible with womanhood. And so these reformatories were designed to restore fallen women. But Black women had no pedestal off which they could fall, right? They were not considered to be women, and so they were not eligible for rehabilitative efforts. To the extent that they were in institutions and were paroled out, often they were paroled out into domestic labor. So if you've ever seen The Color Purple, how many of y'all seen The Color Purple? One of my favorite movies. Miss Sophia is one of my favorite characters. And what happens to Miss Sophia in that film is she is paroled out to work for a white woman, right? So that is the kind of role that these institutions felt were appropriate for Black women, not for them to be seen as full women or as mothers. And as Sarah Haley argues in No Mercy Here, she highlights the way in which Georgia judges viewed a law that said women were ineligible for placement in custodial institutions with men. Right, so white women were systematically directed out of the system, while Black women were systematically directed into it. Now, what's the justification for this? The justification is, again, that white women were seen as true women, delicate women, women whose role in the society was to raise up children. Obviously, that is completely retrograde. But at the end of the day, Black women weren't extended the same sort of courtesy, right? They were not seen as valuable as mothers, valuable to their families or to their communities. They were not allowed to bring their children into these custodial institutions where they were performing hard labor or even to receive assistance or care when they were pregnant. Many women were worked to the point of exhaustion to the very ends of their pregnancies when they were in these institutions. Again, when white women were pregnant and sentenced to reformatories or custodial institutions, often for very serious crimes, often they were pardoned by the governor because of their identities as mothers, right? So we have the systematic derogation of the identities of Black women as mothers, while we have systematic valorization of white women as mothers. And this is the foundation. This is the foundational ideological construct of women's prisons in this country, right? And many of these prisons still stand. Like the Indiana prison, for example. But as the existence of prisons evolved and women's prisons grew, as I mentioned, because of the shifts in terms of policing and the use of law enforcement to manage social problems, the shift toward law and order and the war on drugs, Black women and women more generally began to be arrested at higher rates than they were at the turn of the century when women's prisons were initially being constructed. And so women's prisons expanded across the country. As I mentioned, 40 years ago, most jails did not house women. Today, most jails do. 1.5 million churn in and out of those facilities. Now, you can't really see, I know it's relatively small here, the kinds of crimes that women are being arrested for, but many of them are larceny, other sort of misdemeanor assaults, drug use, possession, driving under the influence, disorderly conduct, drunkenness, violation of liquor laws, drug sales, fraud. The first one up there is sort of an accumulation of various kinds of sort of public order offenses. Right, so again, this is very similar to the kinds of offenses that women were being arrested for at the turn of this 20th century. Right? These are public order, sort of broken windows kinds of offenses that are used to proactively police communities and disorderly bodies who are seen as a threat to public order and public morals. And these are the same kinds of offenses that land women in jail today. And when we think about how women are perceived, it's similar to their forebears, right? And the increase of Black and Latina women into women's facilities shifted how women prisoners were seen, right? At the turn of the century, when women's prisons were being constructed, women prisoners were seen as essentially, again, fallen women who needed to be redeemed. As Black and Latinx women entered into these facilities, they were seen as largely deviant and irredeemable. So the stigma that was attached to their racial identity and gender identity followed them into these other institutions, which became far more punitive, far more degrading, and engaged in far more punitive policing of their reproductive choices and affected their families and communities in ways that I'll discuss in just a moment. Right, so incapacitation is what is driving how women are being policed, right? The idea that they are risks to the society because of their reproductive capacity, because of their failure as parents or as mothers, right? Because of their criminal rule breaking that is largely result often of mental illness, of poverty, of prior trauma. Those are precisely the kinds of things that landed women in mental institutions at the turn of the century. Those are precisely the kinds of things that landed women in reformatories where they were subject to all kinds of regulations in an effort to redeem them. Or those are precisely the kinds of things that landed Black women in prisons without any kind of acknowledgement or respect for their roles as caregivers for their children. And again, because Black women and Latinx women are stigmatized and are now the majority, over 2/3 of women who are in prison, the stigmas that existed at the turn of the century continue to function and continue to animate how they are treated in the criminal justice system. Similar kinds of crimes, similar kinds of treatment in facilities. And here I'm highlighting some ways that the criminal justice system in the carceral state directly impact and incapacitate women's reproductive and familial autonomy. So these are 3 cases involving the criminal prosecution of women for their choices either during pregnancy or as they are parenting. So in this case, this is a case from Arizona. This woman was arrested and prosecuted for child neglect after she left her child in the car while she went in for a job interview. She was homeless at the time and didn't have any resources to hire a caregiver while she went on the interview. So she was left essentially with no choice. So she left the child in the car, went in for the interview, and when she came out, someone had called the police on her, and she was prosecuted for child neglect. Right, again, reinforcing this stereotype of Black women as pathological, incompetent mothers who are a threat to the society and therefore deserving of prosecution and punishment. This is Kelly Williams Bolar. She sent her child, she's from Cleveland, Ohio. She sent her child to a school that was outside of her district, but was a better school for the child. She was arrested for theft of educational services, which is a felony. This woman on the far right, my far right, is Mallory Loyola. She was the first woman arrested in the state of Tennessee under a law criminalizing the ingestion of illegal substances and only illegal substances during pregnancy. She consumed meth. Her child was born healthy. Nevertheless, she was arrested and prosecuted for violating this law. This is the first law in the country that directly criminalized pregnant women for drug use. So these are ways in which the criminal justice system is directly regulating the choices and the reproductive autonomy, the familial autonomy of women, right, on a very direct way in terms of the charges that are being brought. There are other ways that the criminal justice system affects women and their childbearing and their ability to parent and to mother. And these are less direct ways, right? So you have most women who are incarcerated are in their prime reproductive years, and I'm pushing that out to say 45, okay, prime reproductive years. So they're in their prime reproductive years, and as the little boy mentioned in the clip that I showed you, right, often women will cycle in and out of jail or prison for very low-level crimes that disrupt their ability to have children should they want them or to parent the children that they do have. Right? So the average length of a sentence for women who are incarcerated is about 24 months. Or it used to be about maybe 10 or so years ago, or excuse me, a few years ago. That may have come down because of some of the reforms that have taken place. You have incapacitation of their reproductive capacities through sterilization. In the state of California in 2005, the Center for Investigative Reporting found that over 250 women were sterilized under very dubious circumstances where it was questionable whether they were informed, whether they gave informed consent, or whether they were told at all that they were being sterilized. So for example, I had a client when I worked at the Lawyers Committee who came to see me and was telling, she had a small son, and I was asking her, and she had had him while she was incarcerated. Another way that women are subject to being punished or penalized for choosing to have children, approximately 5% of women who are in jails or prisons are pregnant at some point during their incarceration. Many of them don't get appropriate medical care, and many of them are shackled during labor and childbirth, right? Again, reinforcing this idea that their childbearing is dangerous. So Kimberly was one of those women. She was pregnant while she was incarcerated for a probation violation. Okay, she was sent to state prison for a technical probation violation. She was shackled when she was taken to the hospital. This was before this was prohibited in the state of California. She was then on the table. She was forced to have a cesarean, which she did not choose. She did not choose to have a cesarean. The prison chose for her. Her pregnancy, her delivery was induced. They did not tell her the date. They did not allow her to call any members of her family, right? So she's in the hospital. She's on the table. She's sedated, about to have surgery, major surgery to give birth. And the doctor says, so we're doing a tubal ligation, right? And she says, I don't want a tubal ligation, because you're still conscious while this is happening. She says, I don't want to be sterilized. And he says, I thought you did. She says, I didn't sign any paperwork. I don't want to be sterilized. She, to this day, does not know whether he went forward with the tubal ligation. She does not know whether she was sterilized or not. She was one of those women where this practice was occurring, right? And you have the doctor who performed the procedures saying this, right? The cost of sterilization of incarcerated women is, quote, minimal compared to what you save in welfare paying for these unwanted children as they procreate more. Right, so this is precisely the kind of language that suggests Black and brown women's procreation is an existential threat that the prison and the carceral state is regulating, as it did at its beginning. So these are sort of the direct and indirect ways that prison is regulating women. You also have guards, right, articulating this kind of stigmatized identity that women have as mothers, right? So you have one guard that says, I'm a mother of two, and I know that impulse, that instinct, that mothering instinct that feels like it just takes over. You would never put your kids in harm's way. Women in here lack that. Something in their nature is not right, you know? They run out and leave their kids alone, babies, while they score drugs or go over to their boyfriend's house, you know? That's a sign that something is wrong, some kind of psychological problem or something, right? So the prison officials, right? The guards, the doctors, the women themselves understand that this is the way that they're looked upon. Their children often aren't able to visit. So the clip that I showed you, that's unusual. 80% of women don't get visits. They often aren't able to communicate with their children because of the exorbitant costs of calls. Many of their children are in the foster care system, and as a condition of maintaining their parental rights and their relationship with their children, they have to be in contact with their children. Many of them never hear from their lawyer, and they don't know when critical proceedings are happening, so they're more likely to lose custody of their children. These are the indirect ways in which the reproductive and familial autonomy of women are incapacitated as a result of contact with the criminal justice system. Okay, so I'm running out of time. So I'm going to sort of begin to wrap it up. But I just want to note here that if you're thinking, well, what about the Constitution, right? Doesn't the Constitution prevent these kind of abuses? Well, yes and no, right? So there have been some federal cases that have prohibited the practice of shackling during labor and childbirth, but there have been there's been one court that has come to that conclusion in a case called Nelson versus Correctional Medical Services. But two other courts, including the Ninth Circuit, have said this is not necessarily an established right to be free of shackling during labor and childbirth under a qualified immunity framework. You have also the Supreme Court saying people who are incarcerated have a diminished expectation of their constitutional rights. So in a case called Turner versus Safley, the court says, well, yes, people who are incarcerated have constitutional rights, but they only have those rights that are consistent with the penological objectives of the prison. So this inverts what is a traditional sort of fundamental right framework, right, where the rights of the individual are considered to be paramount, right, in theory. And then if the state wishes to burden them, they have to have a compelling justification. Under this framework, it's simply rational basis. And the Ninth Circuit, in applying Turner versus Safley, said that the right to procreation does not survive incarceration. Courts have not struck down, when challenged, draconian visitation policies that prohibit contact visits, or some states are abolishing in-person visits altogether in favor of video conferencing. So you have courts that have simply evacuated themselves from this space and have deferred to prison officials, which leaves women vulnerable to the kinds of abuses that I've described. So what do we do about this? As I said, I think what we have to do is really take a hard look at how we're using the criminal justice system, right? How we are using the resources of the criminal justice system to regulate women who are struggling with issues like poverty, homelessness, mental illness, trauma. 80% of women who are incarcerated have been previously sexually or physically abused. They continue to be abused often in jails and prisons and detention centers. They have higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of mental illness, and we're using the criminal justice system to police these unruly, undisciplined bodies who are seen as a threat because of the sort of pathologies that we apply to the individual rather than the structure of society, rather than having a structural analysis of how the society is producing these dynamics in the lives of vulnerable women. So in the paper, I say we need to turn to reproductive justice. We need to look at a reproductive justice frame, which basically calls for the resources necessary for women to make choices about their bodies, about their sexuality, about their childbearing, about their parenting with dignity and safety. So what does that mean? That means we provide enough housing for people. That means we provide sufficient employment, that we provide medical care, that we provide child care. Right? If we did those things, that would be fundamentally incompatible with a society that invests in prisons, right? Because of the costs of our law enforcement entities in this country, right? Simply swamp what we are spending on robust social welfare services, right? That could support women like the ones you saw in the short clip and their children. That means that we have to be focused on abolishing prisons as they exist today. And this is part of the reason why I asked Jasleen to mention the work that I'm doing with the Civilian Oversight Commission. So today, in 2018, the County of Los Angeles has decided to go forward with a plan to spend $2 billion on a new women's gender-responsive jail, right? In Lancaster, California. No shade to Lancaster if you're from there, but it's far. Right? It's far from centers like Los Angeles, where most women who are incarcerated come from, and it reproduces the precise dynamics that I'm talking about here, right? So we need to fundamentally rethink how we're using prisons if we are to fundamentally disrupt this dynamic of the incapacitation of motherhood. So I think we have until 1:30, is that right? So we have about 10 minutes. So I'll stop there and take any questions or comments that you all have. Thank you. Yes.
It seems that the privatization, private prison industry is driving administration. I mean, it's taxpayers' money given to private corporations to basically give them a setup to keep people in there longer.
Right.
Than they should. But where's the backlash?
Well, I think there's quite a bit of backlash to private prisons.
There's 2,000 folks out in Texas that live in desert tents.
Yeah, right. I mean, this is precisely what I'm talking about in terms of how we use prisons to regulate reproductive and familial autonomy, right? The removal of children from their parents and the placement of those children into private prisons and camps is an example of this. And I think that there is backlash, but we have to do the work of informing people what's happening, right? We have to mobilize to resist the use of private prisons. But frankly, private prisons account for a small percentage of where people are placed, right? So we talk about private prisons as if this is the major problem, that private entities are profiting off of incarceration and suffering. And that is true, it is a problem. But that accounts for maybe 10 to 15% of the overall prison population. Most are in publicly run jails, prisons, and detention centers. And in fact, LA County is repurposing this jail that they want to create for women. It used to be an ICE facility, right? LA County was leasing out its facilities to Immigrations and Customs Enforcement for immigration detention, right? So we see that there's a clear overlap in terms of the punishment and incarceration of folks under the auspices of the criminal legal system and the immigration system. So yes, but I don't think we should overemphasize private prisons. They're important for us to resist, but we also need to think about how public prisons are operating.
It seems under this administration, there's all these contracts.
Yes, that's true. That's true. I'm going to take another question. Are there other questions? Yes.
I know you spoke a little bit about this need for a systemic change in the way we run our prisons. But for someone like me who wants to be a public defender, for example, what is something we can do that's more immediate in our day-to-day interactions with female clients?
Well, one is, I think, to understand your clients and to really listen to them. When I've interacted with women, for example, at a New Way of Life or other institutions, there's a great organization in San Bernardino called Time for a Change Foundation. And one of the things that they've said to me is that they felt their lawyers didn't listen to them, right? And when I've trained public defenders, for example, many of them have no idea about the statistics that I shared with you around the trauma that women experience, the significant rates of homelessness, joblessness, illness, and so forth. So really helping to humanize your client, one, by listening to them, and then humanizing them to various criminal justice actors, I think is really, really important, right? Obviously, defending people is critical, and we need to figure out as public defenders, right, how do we push for radical, meaningful reforms of the criminal justice system. So I think those two things are ways that public defenders can really be critically engaged in meaningful, radical reform. I think there's another question. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I am wondering how what you have presented us with here maps onto the experiences of trans women, more in particular Black trans women, and how they are refused access to womanhood within incarceration, whereas the California justice system, as it is set up, does allow white trans women such as Shiloh Quinn access to womanhood and therefore reproductive services, etc.
Right.
So I'm wondering, like, if you're thinking through the experience of trans women as we're talking about like women, and how do we include women who are locked in male facilities within the framework of what you're doing?
Yeah, so I have talked, in the paper I do talk about how trans and queer women are policed, right? So often trans women, for example, in LA County, are not placed in women's facilities, right? They're fundamentally denied access to their gender identity. They're placed in men's facilities, and I forget, Bianca was here from the Williams Institute. They're placed in something called the K6G unit, which is the LGBT unit in Men's Central. Right? Only a handful of women are placed in the women's facility, and the concern is that trans women will prey on cisgendered women, right? And who are the predators, right? The predators are Black trans women, right? So they are both masculinized in terms of the physical threat, while being denied the access to their gender identity in terms of being women. In addition, the sterilization process that was happening in California women's prisons, trans women were particularly targeted by the doctor that was performing, trans men who were placed in women's prisons were particularly targeted by the doctor who was performing these sterilizations, basically arguing, what do you need your uterus for? Right? You don't need to use it, right? You're a man, right? So you don't need your essential organs, right? So trans men who were misgendered and placed in women's prisons were then targeted by prison officials because of their gender identity, right? As defective and so forth. So there are a lot of dynamics when it comes to one, misgendering, the vulnerability to sexual violence, but at the same time being described as predators. The same thing happened roughly 10 years ago, again, in LA County jails. I know a lot about LA County jails now. In LA County jails, where there was something called a dyke tank, that existed in the women's facility, because the idea was it's sort of the contrary of what was happening in the men's facility, which is where vulnerable men are put in the queer, trans women. Others are put into the LGBT unit, which is a protective custody unit, because the idea is the rest of the men are predators and will prey on them. But in the women's facility, the idea was that lesbian women were predators toward non-queer women. And most of the women who were in the Dyke tank were Black women. Right? So again, this sort of masculinization of Black women, labeling them as violent predators and threats, and putting them in a deeply degrading environment that was even more degrading than the general population, which is very similar to what was happening in custodial institutions, again, at the turn of the century, where Black women were systematically placed in horrendous custodial environments, while white women who were seen as more delicate were placed in reform institutions. So sexuality plays a major role, not only in terms of how women are policed, but then their experience once they're incarcerated. This also exists with regard to the juvenile population. There was a study, I think it might have been the Williams Institute that co-authored it or co-sponsored it, that found that roughly 40% of the girls in juvenile detention identify as queer, right? So there's a policing of racial identity, there's a policing of sexual identity, because again, Black women and Latinx women and gender nonconforming people, trans women and men, are seen as deviant, unruly bodies that need to be policed and disciplined, right? But not redeemed, incapacitated. So that's what I think is happening. I think we have time for maybe one last question. Yes.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you, for an excellent talk, and it was really interesting to me. I've worked with human rights laws actually on issues facing trans women in immigration detention facilities, and it was just striking to hear the parallels of many of the practices. And I'm just curious, as far as a broader advocacy framing, how do you personally, as an advocate, as an academic, balance the objectives of course, pursuing abolition, but in the interim, reforming conditions,
Yeah.
and trying to prevent these horrific practices that are being carried out?
Well, I think you stated it perfectly, right? That's what you have to do both, but we also have to be careful about which reforms we pursue. So Miriam Kaba calls harmful reforms non-reformist, non-reform reform, right? So there are the kinds of reforms that simply legitimize the institution. There's a great paper by Heather Schoenfeld called The Paradox of Prison Litigation, which is to say, when advocates successfully sue the state for violations of constitutional rights, what happens is it actually enlarges the carceral state rather than shrinking it. So we have to think about how we're using reform tactics so it doesn't further legitimize and expand the very violence and the harm that the carceral state is inflicting on our communities. So for example, this jail is being framed as a reform. It's being framed as gender responsive, that it'll be better for children and so forth. And that has never happened in the history of our country, where we build more jails and things get better. That has never happened. The same thing happened in Canada. The conditions were just as horrendous. Why? Because this is fundamental to the institutions. This is how they operate. So what we're calling for, and I'm calling for as a proponent of Reform LA Jails, is to put a halt and to do systematic reinvestment of that $2 billion. So I hope y'all will get on board with that. But it's called Reform LA Jails, and we are, I think, out of time. So I will stop here, but thank you so much for being a great audience.